The words hit her like a physical blow. Franklin Whitmore stood on the dusty platform of Silver Creek Station, his pale eyes raking over Evelina Grant with undisguised disgust. Too chubby for his liking, he declared loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. Not what he ordered. The mail-order-bride arrangement was over before it began. Evelina's carpetbag felt heavy in her gloved hands. The train that brought her from Missouri had already departed, carrying with it her only means of escape. The platform stretched before her like a stage, every face turned in her direction. Some showed pity. Most showed the cruel satisfaction of witnessing another's downfall. She had imagined this moment differently during the long journey west. Franklin's letters had spoken of companionship, of building something together in the Colorado Territory. His photograph showed a stern but decent-looking man. Nothing had prepared her for this public humiliation. The September sun beat down mercilessly. Dust swirled around her dark traveling dress, the one she had sewn carefully by candlelight back in Kansas City. It was her finest garment, chosen to make a good first impression. Now it felt like a costume in a play she no longer wanted to perform. Franklin adjusted his vest with theatrical precision. He was a man who enjoyed his moment of power, savoring the attention of the small crowd that had gathered to witness the arrival of his intended bride. His rejection carried the weight of a judge's verdict. Evelina straightened her shoulders. Whatever waited for her in this dusty Colorado town, she would face it with dignity intact. The crowd expected her to weep, to beg, to crumble under the weight of rejection. She would give them none of it. The station master cleared his throat uncomfortably. A few women in the crowd whispered behind their hands. Children stared with the unblinking curiosity of youth. But one figure remained perfectly still in the shadow of the depot building, watching with an intensity that made the air itself seem charged. Boone Wilder had witnessed many injustices in Silver Creek, but this particular cruelty sparked something fierce in his chest. He studied the woman Franklin had so publicly discarded. Her posture spoke of strength despite the humiliation. Her silence carried more dignity than all of Franklin's bluster. Evelina's mind raced through her limited options. The return ticket to Missouri remained in her reticule, but using it meant facing dangers she had fled. Staying meant surviving in a town where her first introduction had been through shame. Neither choice offered comfort. Franklin gestured dismissively toward the station house. The show was over. The crowd began to disperse, carrying with them a story they would tell at dinner tables across Silver Creek. The colored woman from Missouri who wasn't good enough. The mail-order bride who got sent back like damaged goods. But Evelina noticed something else. Two men in dark coats lingered near the telegraph office, their attention fixed on her with professional interest. They wore the look of men conducting business, not satisfying curiosity. Her blood chilled. The danger she had fled from Missouri might have followed her west. Boone stepped forward from the shadows. His weathered hands hung loose at his sides, but his jaw carried the tension of controlled anger. He had watched Franklin arrange 3 mail-order bride meetings in the past year. Each had ended in rejection for reasons that revealed more about Franklin's character than the women's worth. This time felt different. This woman carried herself like someone who had already survived worse than Franklin could dish out. Her rejection sparked something protective in Boone's chest, a feeling he had not experienced since leaving his former life behind. Evelina felt the stranger's gaze before she saw him. When their eyes met across the emptying platform, she recognized something familiar. Another outsider, another person who existed on the margins of Silver Creek society. His clothes were rough but clean, his beard trimmed despite its wildness. His eyes held intelligence Franklin's lacked. The two men in dark coats moved closer. One consulted a piece of paper pulled from his vest pocket. The other surveyed the dispersing crowd with the methodical attention of a hunter. Evelina's heart hammered against her ribs. Missouri felt very close suddenly. Franklin dusted off his hands as if completing an unpleasant chore. He nodded to several townspeople, accepting their murmured condolences for his disappointment. Playing the wronged party came naturally to him. The performance was almost believable. Boone made his decision. He approached Evelina with measured steps, careful not to startle her or draw unwanted attention from the men who seemed far too interested in her arrival. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. The offer was simple: temporary shelter until she could arrange passage elsewhere. No strings attached. No expectations beyond basic human decency. Evelina studied his face for deception and found none, but trust had become a luxury she could no longer afford. The dark-coated men moved closer still. One spoke quietly to the station master, gesturing in her direction. Time was running short. Whatever safety this stranger offered had to be weighed against the certainty of danger closing in around her. Silver Creek stretched beyond the depot, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to hope in the high desert. Somewhere in those dusty streets lay either sanctuary or another trap. The choice was hers to make, but the window for making it was rapidly closing. Evelina's fingers tightened around her carpetbag handle. The stranger's offer hung in the air between them while the dark-coated men pressed closer through the dispersing crowd. His weathered face showed no deception, but trust was a door she had learned to keep locked. The mountain man waited. No pressure in his stance, no urgency in his breathing. Just steady patience that spoke of someone accustomed to earning what he needed slowly. His hands remained visible, empty of threat. One of the dark-coated men approached the station master with practiced authority. Paper exchanged hands. Questions were asked in voices too low to carry but urgent enough to quicken pulses. Evelina's time for deliberation was bleeding away with each passing second. She nodded once. Sharp. Final. Boone led her away from the depot without backward glances. His stride was measured, unhurried despite the circumstances. Every step carried them deeper into Silver Creek's dusty heart, past storefronts where curious faces pressed against glass windows. The town felt smaller with each block they walked. Conversations died as they passed. Whispers sprouted in their wake. By evening, everyone would know about Franklin's rejected bride and the mountain man who took her in. Stories would grow in the telling. Boone's horse stood tied outside Murphy's general store, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes and well-maintained tack. She nickered softly at his approach, ears forward with welcome. The animal's calm demeanor spoke well of her owner's character. Evelina had ridden before, but side-saddle on gentle mounts during Sunday outings. This mare was built for mountain work, for carrying burdens across terrain that would challenge lesser horses. The prospect of riding her both thrilled and terrified. Boone helped her mount without ceremony. His hands were careful, respectful of boundaries even in necessity. The touch lasted only long enough to ensure her safety, then withdrew. Some men would have lingered. He stepped back immediately. The ride out of Silver Creek revealed the town's true size. What had seemed substantial from the depot proved to be a thin collection of buildings clinging to hope in the high desert. Beyond the last weathered fence posts, the world opened into vastness that made eastern landscapes seem cramped. Mountains rose ahead, blue-shadowed and magnificent. Pine forests cloaked their slopes in dark green that promised coolness after the sun-baked streets. The trail wound upward through terrain that spoke of isolation, of places where a person could disappear entirely from the world below. Evelina had never seen country so raw, so unforgiving in its beauty. Each switchback revealed new vistas that stole breath and challenged comprehension. This was not the gentle wilderness of Missouri woodlands. This was nature in its most honest form. Boone rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. He read the trail ahead, adjusted their pace for the horse's comfort, scanned the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. Mountain living had honed him into something between civilized man and wild creature. They stopped twice to rest the horses. During these pauses, silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions. Evelina studied her rescuer when she thought he wasn't watching. His clothes were rough but well-mended. His gear was maintained with military precision. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled in a grove of aspens whose leaves whispered secrets in the afternoon breeze. It was larger than expected, built with the solid craftsmanship of someone who understood mountain weather. Smoke rose lazily from the stone chimney. Books lined one entire wall of the single room, volumes that spoke of education, of a mind that hungered for knowledge despite geographic isolation. Shakespeare stood beside agricultural manuals. Poetry neighbored practical guides to wilderness survival. Evelina's surprise must have shown on her face. Boone's mouth quirked upward in what might have been amusement. The expression transformed his weathered features, revealing glimpses of the man he had been before the mountains claimed him. He prepared coffee with the same methodical care he had shown on the trail. Every movement served a purpose. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. The beverage that emerged was better than anything served in Silver Creek's hotel dining room. Evening settled over the high country with the weight of centuries. Coyotes began their nightly chorus in the distance. Wind moved through the aspens, setting their leaves to dancing in silver-green cascades. The world felt both vast and intimate. Evelina finally spoke the truth that had been building in her chest since leaving Missouri. She had witnessed something in Kansas City that powerful men wanted buried. Murder dressed up as business. Blood on polished floors. A wealthy man's rage when his partner threatened to expose their illegal dealings. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush that left her breathless. Boone listened without judgment, his face carved from stone in the firelight. When she finished, silence reclaimed the cabin. But it was different now. Shared burden had changed its texture. Boone revealed his own secrets with the same careful honesty. The schoolhouse where he had taught children to read. The false accusations that destroyed his reputation. The choice between fighting a rigged system or finding peace in places where systems held no power. They were both refugees, she realized. Both casualties of a world that valued appearance over truth, convenience over justice. The recognition created something fragile but real between them. Understanding born of shared exile. The cabin's single room forced intimacy without impropriety. Boone had arranged a curtained alcove for her privacy, complete with washstand and mirror. The consideration spoke of experience in making others comfortable, of natural kindness that had survived disappointment. Sleep came fitfully for Evelina that first night. Mountain sounds were foreign to ears accustomed to city rhythms, but beneath the strangeness lay something else. For the first time in months, she felt safe enough to truly rest. Morning brought the scent of pine and coffee, of bacon frying over an expertly tended fire. Boone moved through his routine with quiet efficiency, preparing enough for two without asking if she was hungry. Some kindnesses required no discussion. Outside, the world had transformed in the darkness. Frost silvered the meadow grass despite the September date. The high country lived by different rules, demanded different strengths. Evelina wondered if she possessed what this place would require. Boone handed her a cup of coffee and gestured toward the eastern mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay Silver Creek, already feeling distant as yesterday's worry. Behind them stretched the unknown, vast as the sky and twice as complicated. The choice was hers to make. Stay until she could arrange passage elsewhere, or venture back into a world that had little use for inconvenient truths. Neither option promised safety, but one offered the possibility of something she had never dared imagine. The first lesson began with firewood. Boone handed Evelina an axe worn smooth by countless hands, its weight foreign in her gloved palms. The blade caught morning light, reflecting possibilities she had never considered. City living had not prepared her for this. The wood split clean under her first swing, then her second. Each strike sent vibrations through her arms, awakening muscles that had known only gentle use. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the mountain chill. Her hands began to blister beneath the soft leather. Boone watched without correction, letting her find her own rhythm. His silence spoke of patience earned through years of teaching reluctant students. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, through the honest ache of work well done. By noon, Evelina had split enough kindling to last 3 days. Her shoulders burned with unfamiliar fatigue. Blisters had formed and broken, leaving her palms raw but stronger. The pile of split wood represented something more than fuel. It was proof of capability she had never tested. The second lesson involved water. The creek that supplied Boone's cabin ran cold and clear a quarter-mile downhill through dense pine forest. Carrying full buckets back up the slope demanded strength, balance, and stubborn determination. Evelina possessed 2 of the 3. She spilled half the first bucket on the rocky path. The second bucket made it halfway before her grip failed. By the 4th trip, calluses were forming where blisters had been. By the 6th, she managed to deliver both buckets without losing a drop. Boone nodded once when she set the full buckets beside his door. Approval given sparingly carried more weight than lavish praise. The gesture warmed her more than the afternoon sun on her shoulders. Evening brought reading by firelight. Boone's collection revealed tastes that spanned continents and centuries. Philosophy nestled beside poetry. Agricultural texts shared shelf space with Shakespeare. The breadth of his learning challenged every assumption about mountain men. Evelina chose Emerson, drawn to words about self-reliance and inner strength. The pages fell open to passages that seemed written for her circumstances, about finding truth in solitude, about the courage required to trust one's own judgment against the world's opinion. Boone read silently across the fire, his weathered face illuminated by dancing flames. Occasionally he would pause, finger marking his place, eyes focused on something beyond the cabin walls. Memory, perhaps, or plans taking shape in the darkness outside. The third morning brought revelation. Evelina woke to find him bent over a writing desk, pen moving across paper with careful precision. His handwriting flowed in elegant loops and careful angles. The script belonged to someone educated far beyond her expectations. He was composing a letter to the territorial governor, not the rough scrawl of a mountain hermit, but the measured prose of someone who understood government, law, and the careful presentation of evidence. The man she had taken for a simple woodsman revealed depths that challenged her assumptions. Over breakfast, the truth emerged in careful installments. Boone had taught school in Denver before the accusations destroyed his reputation. False charges brought by a prominent family whose son he had disciplined for cheating. Money and influence had outweighed truth and justice. The mountains had offered refuge when civilization failed him, but education remained, refined by solitude and tempered by experience. He read voraciously, wrote correspondence with territorial officials, and maintained connections to a world that had cast him out. Evelina shared her own revelation that afternoon. The murder she had witnessed in Kansas City carried implications beyond simple violence. The dead man had been investigating territorial land grants, following a trail of corruption that reached into Colorado politics. His killer had too much invested to let the investigation continue. They walked the forest paths while she spoke, their voices lost in pine whispers and creek songs. The details spilled out gradually, each one adding weight to the danger that had followed her west. By sunset, Boone understood why the dark-coated men had seemed so determined. Franklin Whitmore's name surfaced during the evening meal. Boone's jaw tightened as he revealed the pattern he had observed. 3 mail-order brides in 18 months, each rejected for superficial reasons, each left stranded and vulnerable. The man seemed to enjoy the power of refusal more than the prospect of companionship. Worse, Franklin had been asking questions about Evelina since her arrival. Not the idle curiosity of a rejected suitor, but the focused interest of someone expecting compensation for information. The realization sent cold fingers of fear down Evelina's spine. Boone had been watching Franklin's correspondence for months, intercepting letters when possible, documenting the pattern of cruelty. What had begun as protective instinct had evolved into something more systematic. He was building a case, gathering evidence of deliberate deception. The fire burned low while they talked, shadows stretching and dancing across cabin walls. Outside, wind moved through the aspens with increasing urgency. Weather was changing in the high country, carrying with it the promise of early winter. Evelina studied Boone's face in the dying firelight. Here was a man who had chosen exile over compromise, solitude over surrender. His books had kept his mind sharp, but it was his heart that had drawn her into safety. Recognition bloomed between them, fragile as new ice. The fourth day brought visitors. Riders approached through the morning mist, their horses picking careful paths up the mountain trail. Two men in dark coats, the same ones who had watched her at the depot. They rode with purpose that sent rabbits scrambling and birds into nervous flight. Boone spotted them first from his position at the woodpile. His axe paused mid-swing, every line of his body going alert. He set the tool aside with deliberate care, hands staying visible while his mind calculated distances and options. Evelina emerged from the cabin with fresh coffee, the cup freezing halfway to her lips. The riders were still distant but close enough to recognize. Her past had finally caught up to the present, arriving on horseback through the September morning. The mountain meadows stretched between cabin and forest, offering no cover for retreat. The trail down to Silver Creek remained the only viable escape route, but the riders controlled that approach. They were trapped by geography and circumstance. Boone moved to her side without haste, his presence solid and reassuring. Together they watched the horsemen approach, carrying with them questions that demanded answers neither was prepared to give. The peaceful morning crackled with tension that set wildlife to silence. One of the riders raised his hand in greeting, the gesture formal rather than friendly. They meant to talk first, these men from Missouri. But the guns on their hips suggested conversation was merely the opening gambit in a game with higher stakes. The wind picked up, scattering aspen leaves across the meadow in golden spirals. Storm clouds gathered over the western peaks, promising weather that would make travel difficult. Nature was choosing sides, offering both obstacle and opportunity to those wise enough to read her signs. The riders halted 20 paces from the cabin, close enough for clear conversation, far enough to avoid sudden movements. Their horses stood patient and alert, trained for work that required steady nerves and quick reflexes. The lead rider dismounted with practiced ease. His dark coat bore trail dust but no wear, suggesting recent purchase rather than long use. His companion remained mounted, hands resting loose on the saddle horn. Both men carried themselves with the careful alertness of professionals. Evelina recognized them from the depot, though they looked larger against the mountain backdrop. The thin air and vast sky had a way of making everything seem more significant, more dangerous. Her coffee cup trembled slightly in her hands. Boone stepped forward, placing himself between the visitors and Evelina. The movement appeared casual, but his shoulders carried new tension. Years of mountain living had taught him to read the signs that preceded trouble. The lead rider introduced himself as Morrison, claimed to represent business interests in Kansas City. His voice carried authority wrapped in false politeness. Legal papers emerged from his coat pocket, folded documents that rustled in the mountain wind. Morrison spoke of witness obligations, of justice served and debts paid. His words painted pictures of duty and civic responsibility. But his eyes remained cold, calculating, measuring distances and escape routes with professional interest. The second rider finally dismounted, his movement fluid despite apparent age. Silver touched his temples, but his hands remained steady, competent. He introduced himself as Pierce, Morrison's associate. The title meant nothing and everything. Snow began falling while Morrison explained their mission. Large flakes drifted down from the darkening sky, settling on hat brims and horse manets. The early storm caught everyone unprepared, adding urgency to an already tense situation. Evelina found her voice despite the fear clawing at her throat. She denied knowledge of any crime, claimed mistaken identity, with conviction that almost sounded genuine. The lies came easier than expected, shaped by weeks of practice in the mirror. Morrison smiled without warmth. He produced a photograph from his coat, a clear image that destroyed her denials instantly. Someone in Kansas City had captured her face with remarkable clarity, creating evidence that eliminated doubt. The conversation took on new weight after the photograph appeared. Morrison's politeness began wearing thin, revealing the steel beneath. Pierce moved with increasing restlessness, his patience clearly finite. Boone spoke for the first time since the introductions. His voice carried mountain quiet, the kind of calm that preceded either complete surrender or absolute defiance. He asked questions about jurisdiction, about warrants and legal authority. Morrison's answers revealed more than he intended. These men carried no official sanction, possessed no legitimate authority. They were private agents working for private interests, operating beyond the reach of territorial law. The revelation changed everything. Evelina straightened, some of her fear transforming into anger. These men were bounty hunters dressed as lawmen, collecting blood money for murder disguised as justice. Pierce's hand moved closer to his gun when Evelina's demeanor shifted. The gesture was slight but unmistakable, a professional's response to changing circumstances. The conversation balanced on the edge of violence. Snow fell harder, beginning to accumulate on the ground and cabin roof. The storm was arriving ahead of schedule, promising to trap everyone in this mountain meadow until weather permitted travel. Boone suggested they continue the discussion inside, away from the worsening conditions. His invitation sounded reasonable, hospitable even. But Evelina caught the calculation in his eyes, the careful assessment of odds and options. Morrison declined the invitation with suspicious courtesy. He preferred to conclude their business quickly, to depart before the storm made travel impossible. Time was working against his interests with each passing minute. The standoff stretched while snow continued falling. 4 people faced each other across 20 feet of meadow grass, each waiting for someone else to make the decisive move. The horses shifted restlessly, sensing tension their riders could barely contain. Franklin Whitmore emerged from the tree line like a ghost made flesh. His sudden appearance shocked everyone, disrupting the careful balance of the confrontation. He rode a borrowed horse with obvious discomfort, his city clothes soaked from the storm. Franklin's presence transformed the situation completely. His arrival revealed the true scope of the betrayal, the depth of planning that had gone into tracking Evelina to this remote cabin. Coincidence died in the face of such coordination. Morrison's greeting to Franklin confirmed suspicions that had been building in Evelina's mind. The rejected suitor and the bounty hunters were partners in this enterprise, connected by greed rather than justice. Franklin's explanation spilled out in nervous bursts. His cousin in Kansas City had promised substantial payment for information about Evelina's whereabouts. The rejected bride had become a business opportunity, a way to recover the investment in correspondence and expectations. The web of betrayal stretched back to Missouri, forward to Colorado, encompassing strangers and supposed allies alike. Every letter Franklin had written, every kindness he had shown during their correspondence, had been calculated steps toward this moment. Boone's jaw tightened as Franklin revealed how long he had been watching, planning, positioning himself to profit from tragedy. The mail-order-bride arrangement had been a trap from the beginning, baited with false promises and empty dreams. Snow swirled around the 5 figures in the meadow, creating a world that seemed divorced from normal reality. The storm was intensifying, promising to strand them all in this high valley until weather permitted escape. Morrison grew increasingly agitated as conditions worsened. His careful plan was unraveling in the face of mountain weather that recognized no human schedule. Nature was imposing her own timeline on their confrontation. Pierce checked his pocket watch with obvious concern. They needed to conclude this business and reach lower ground before the storm trapped them completely. Mountain winters were unforgiving to the unprepared. Evelina felt something shifting inside her chest as she watched the 3 men plan her fate. Fear was transforming into something harder, more durable. These men saw her as cargo to be delivered, not a person with rights and dignity. Boone moved closer to her side, his presence solid and reassuring. Whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. The realization brought strength she had not known she possessed. The wind picked up, driving snow horizontally across the meadow. Visibility dropped rapidly as the storm reached full intensity. The mountain was asserting its dominance over human plans and ambitions. Morrison made his decision. They would take Evelina now, storm or no storm. Delay meant losing the opportunity entirely, meant returning to Kansas City empty-handed and unpaid. Franklin shifted nervously in his saddle as Morrison's intentions became clear. He had wanted the money, but had not considered the violence that might be required to earn it. Reality was proving more complex than greed had anticipated. The moment balanced on the edge of action. Snow fell between them, muffling sound and blurring sight. In this white-trapped world, anything might happen. The mountain held its breath, waiting for the first move that would determine everything. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun with deliberate slowness. The gesture was meant to intimidate, to end resistance before it could begin. But mountain snow had other plans, swirling between them in thick curtains that turned certainty into guesswork. Boone shifted his weight forward, muscles coiling beneath worn fabric. Years of reading mountain weather had taught him to recognize opportunity disguised as obstacle. The storm that trapped them also provided cover, concealment, confusion. Pierce stepped sideways, trying to flank their position while maintaining distance from his partner. Professional instincts guided his movement, but city training had not prepared him for snow that fell in walls, wind that screamed between peaks. Evelina's fear crystallized into something harder, more useful. These men had traveled hundreds of miles to drag her back to certain death. The distance they had covered spoke of determination that would not be swayed by weather or conscience. Franklin struggled to control his borrowed horse as wind gusted across the meadow. The animal sensed approaching violence, rolling its eyes and sidling away from the confrontation. Even dumb beasts understood what the storm was building toward. Morrison raised his voice above the wind, demanding surrender in terms that brooked no argument. Legal language mixed with barely concealed threats, painting pictures of consequences that extended far beyond this mountain meadow. The photograph reappeared in his gloved hand, protected from snow by old paper, evidence that could not be disputed or reasoned away. Evelina's face stared back at her from the image, captured in a moment when she had believed herself safe. Boone's response came in mountain vernacular, words shaped by altitude and solitude. He spoke of territorial jurisdiction, of rights that existed beyond the reach of Kansas City money. His voice carried the authority of someone who had studied law as well as lived it. Snow accumulated on hat brims and shoulders while the argument continued. Each flake added weight to the gathering storm, building toward conditions that would make travel impossible. Nature was choosing sides without regard for human plans. Pierce produced rope from his saddlebags, thick strands designed for securing cargo rather than comforting passengers. The message was clear enough to penetrate even Franklin's growing nervousness. This was abduction dressed as law enforcement. The horses began moving restlessly, seeking shelter from wind that cut through the meadow with increasing fury. Even the well-trained mounts were approaching their limits of endurance. The storm was asserting dominance over all living things. Evelina found her voice despite the chaos building around them. She spoke of injustice witnessed, of murder disguised as business, of powerful men who bought silence with gold and violence. Her words carried across the wind with startling clarity. Morrison's patience finally snapped under pressure from weather and defiance. He drew his weapon with practiced speed, metal gleaming dull in the storm light. The gun eliminated arguments, reduced complex situations to simple choices. Boone moved simultaneously, his reaction honed by years when split seconds determined survival. But instead of drawing his own weapon, He grabbed Evelina's arm and dove toward the cabin. Cover was more valuable than confrontation in these conditions. Gunfire cracked across the meadow, sharp reports that echoed off mountain walls before being swallowed by wind. Snow exploded where bullets struck, creating small geysers of white that marked near misses. Pierce's horse reared at the sound, dumping its rider into the accumulating snow. The professional cursed as he rolled clear of iron-shod hooves, his carefully planned approach dissolving into chaos and confusion. Franklin's mount bolted at the first shot, carrying its unwilling rider toward the tree line at dangerous speed. His shouts of protest disappeared into the storm, leaving behind only the memory of his betrayal. Boone and Evelina reached the cabin as more shots rang out. Wood splintered where bullets struck the log walls, but the structure held against the assault. Years of mountain building had created fortress as well as home. Inside, Boone moved with purposeful efficiency. He retrieved his rifle from above the fireplace, checked the load, positioned himself at a window that commanded the meadow. His movements spoke of military training older than his teaching days. Evelina crouched beside the door, heart hammering against her ribs. Through the thick walls she could hear Morrison shouting orders to Pierce, coordinating their attack despite deteriorating conditions. Professional killers adapted quickly to changed circumstances. The storm intensified as if responding to human violence. Wind howled through the cabin's eaves, driving snow through every gap and crevice. The world outside became a white void where shapes moved and vanished without warning. Morrison's voice carried across the meadow, offering terms that sounded reasonable until examined closely. Safe passage back to Kansas City, fair treatment under law, justice served according to proper procedure. Every word was carefully chosen, designed to create doubt and encourage surrender. Boone answered with mountain silence, letting the storm speak for him. No words were necessary when actions had already drawn the lines of conflict. The cabin would be held or lost, but it would not be surrendered. Pierce had recovered his footing and found shelter behind a fallen log at the meadow's edge. From there, he could maintain covering fire while Morrison advanced. The two men worked together with practiced coordination despite the chaos surrounding them. The afternoon light was fading rapidly, hastened by storm clouds that blocked the sun. Darkness would bring new challenges, new opportunities. Night fighting in mountain snow favored those who knew the terrain best. Evelina realized she was no longer simply a witness to violence, but a participant in her own fate. The passive role of victim had been stripped away by circumstances that demanded action, choice, commitment to survival. Boone glanced back at her from his position at the window. In his weathered face she read determination that matched her own, courage that had been tested by years of solitary struggle. They were no longer strangers brought together by chance. A bullet shattered the window glass, sending fragments across the cabin floor. Morrison was testing their defenses, probing for weakness. The professional in him understood that successful assault required intelligence about enemy positions. The fire in the hearth continued burning despite the chaos, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Its warmth pushed back the cold that crept through broken glass and open door. Some things endured regardless of circumstances. Franklin's distant shouts could still be heard from the forest, his borrowed horse apparently having deposited him among the pines. His cries for help went unanswered by partners too busy with their own survival to spare attention for fallen accomplices. Morrison made his final offer, voice strained by cold and frustration. Surrender now and face civilized justice. Continue resistance and accept whatever consequences the storm might bring. The choice was theirs to make. Evelina looked at Boone across the cabin's interior, seeing in his steady gaze the answer she had already chosen. Some battles could not be avoided. Some stands had to be taken regardless of odds or outcome. The storm raged around them, transforming the mountain meadow into a white battlefield where visibility measured in yards and survival required constant vigilance. But inside the cabin, Two people had found something worth defending against any force the world might send against them. Night fell with unnatural speed, hastened by storm clouds that swallowed the last daylight. The cabin became an island of warmth in a sea of white chaos, its windows glowing like beacons against the mountain darkness. Morrison's attacks had grown sporadic as conditions worsened. Even professional determination had limits when snow fell in sheets and wind cut through clothing with knife-edge precision. The storm was winning a war that bullets could not fight. Boone moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, checking supplies and defensive positions. Years of mountain winters had taught him to read weather patterns, to understand when storms meant business. This one would last 3 days minimum. Pierce's occasional shots came from different positions now, indicating movement around the cabin's perimeter. But each new location was further from the structure, suggesting retreat rather than tactical advancement. Cold was driving him back step by step. Franklin's cries for help had finally ceased, replaced by silence that could mean rescue or surrender to elements beyond human control. The forest had swallowed his voice along with his courage, leaving only wind song and falling snow. Evelina tended the fire with practiced hands, feeding it split wood from the pile she had created days earlier. The irony was not lost on her. Skills learned for survival were now keeping them alive during siege. The cabin's thick walls muffled outside sounds, creating a pocket of relative peace within the storm's fury. But tension remained, coiled and ready. Both defenders understood this was intermission, not conclusion. Boone opened a trunk that had remained closed during Evelina's stay. Inside lay documents that spoke of his former life, including correspondence with territorial officials about corruption in land grants. His exile had not ended his pursuit of justice. Among the papers Evelina found letters intercepted from Franklin's correspondence, evidence of the pattern Boone had been documenting. 3 previous mail-order brides, each rejected for increasingly cruel reasons, each left stranded and vulnerable. The scope of Franklin's calculated cruelty became clear as she read. He enjoyed the power of refusal more than the prospect of companionship. Breaking hearts had become entertainment, funded by family money and enabled by distance from consequences. But one letter changed everything. Written in different handwriting, it detailed payments made for information about a certain witness from Missouri. Franklin's cousin had been financing surveillance, tracking Evelina's movements since she left Kansas City. The mail-order bride arrangement had been a trap from the beginning. Franklin's romantic correspondence, his promises of partnership and respect, his invitation to Colorado, all carefully constructed lies designed to deliver her into enemy hands. Morrison's voice carried across the storm one final time, barely audible above the wind. He was withdrawing to lower ground, seeking shelter until weather permitted resumed operations. The mountain had defeated him where bullets had failed. Pierce's retreat followed quickly, marked by hoofbeats that faded into forest silence. The two professionals had been forced to choose between mission completion and personal survival. Winter had made the choice for them. Dawn brought crystalline silence broken only by settling snow. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of early winter. Every surface wore white vestments that sparkled in returning sunlight. Evelina emerged from the cabin to find footprints leading away through the snow. Human tracks mixed with horse prints, all heading downhill towards Silver Creek. The siege was over, ended not by victory but by weather's indifferent power. Franklin appeared at the forest edge, bedraggled and frostbitten but alive. His borrowed horse was gone, leaving him to stumble through snow drifts on unsteady legs. Hypothermia had stripped away his arrogance along with his warmth. Boone found him collapsed beside a pine tree, mumbling apologies that held no weight against the damage he had caused. Mountain cold had succeeded where conscience had failed, reducing the scheming betrayer to a shivering suppliant. Evelina faced the man who had orchestrated her humiliation and attempted abduction. Every instinct demanded retribution, justice served with interest accumulated through suffering. But looking at his pitiful condition, she chose mercy over vengeance. They brought Franklin inside, warmed him by the fire, gave him coffee and blankets. The kindness was not forgiveness, but recognition that survival sometimes required rising above the cruelty of others. Franklin's confession spilled out in grateful bursts. Names, dates, payments received for betraying innocent women. The entire network of corruption and cruelty laid bare by hypothermia and defeat. His cousin's business, Morrison's methods, Pierce's background. The documents Boone had been collecting suddenly gained new significance. Combined with Franklin's testimony, they painted a picture of systematic exploitation that reached from Colorado mining claims to Missouri murder scenes. Spring arrived early that year, melting snow and opening mountain passes weeks ahead of schedule. With it came territorial marshals carrying warrants based on evidence Boone had compiled through patient years of documentation. Morrison and Pierce were arrested in Denver, their professional facade crumbling under legal scrutiny. The network they served was exposed, prosecuted, and dismantled by authorities who had waited years for sufficient evidence. Franklin's wealthy cousin faced trial in Kansas City for murder and conspiracy. The case that had seemed hopeless when Evelina fled Missouri was now strengthened by testimony and documentation that left no room for reasonable doubt. 6 months after the siege, Evelina stood in Silver Creek's schoolhouse, teaching children whose parents had once whispered about the rejected mail-order bride. Respect had been earned through service, acceptance through patient demonstration of character. Boone had returned to teaching as well, his reputation restored by territorial officials who valued his contributions to justice. The false accusations that drove him into exile had been exposed and overturned by the same evidence that freed Evelina. Their wedding took place in late summer, surrounded by mountain families who had learned to judge worth by actions rather than appearances. The ceremony was simple, honest, free from the pretense that had marked their previous lives. The cabin became their shared home, expanded and improved to accommodate 2 lives intertwined by struggle and strengthened by survival. Books filled shelves built by 4 hands working together toward common purpose. When new mail-order brides arrived in Silver Creek, Evelina was there to offer guidance and support. No woman would face rejection alone while she drew breath. The sisterhood of survivors grew with each passing season. The mountain meadow where they had faced Morrison and Pierce became their favorite place for evening walks. What had once been a battlefield was now consecrated ground, where love had proven stronger than fear. Years passed like seasons, marked by small victories and quiet contentments. Children arrived to fill the spaces between books and dreams, carrying forward the lessons their parents had learned about courage, dignity, and the transformative power of unconditional acceptance. The story that began with public humiliation ended with private triumph. 2 broken people had found wholeness in each other, proving that rejection by the wrong person often leads to acceptance by the right one. In the high country where they made their life, beauty was measured not by convention but by character. Where worth was proven through action rather than appearance. Where love grew strong in the soil of mutual respect and shared struggle. The mail-order bride who had been deemed too chubby for one man's narrow standards had become the perfect partner for another's generous heart. The mountain man who had been judged too wild for civilized society had proven too gentle for such harsh judgment. Together they had built something that transcended the limitations others had tried to impose. A love story written in mountain snow and cabin firelight, bound in leather, and sealed with commitment that no storm could break. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.